The shooting and killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Rodney Mitchell in Sarasota is a grim reminder that there are two kinds of policing in America today. One for white communities aimed at serving and protecting them, and one for communities of color, devised to criminalize and control them. Good morning, I'm Ed James, and this is Black Almanac. America's tragedy is the aftermath of Mike Brown's murder, even beyond, in addition to the looting and the police department's war-ready stance. America's tragedy is a recurrence of what we do as Americans in situations that involve young black men. Joining today's discourse is attorney Shelley Freeland Eddy of the Freeland Eddy Law Group. I know everyone's been talking about it, but let's get further into depth into Ferguson, Missouri, and Mike Brown, and the occupation, and how it relates to, as a legal standpoint. We start with what we know. Okay. 18-year-old, unarmed, black man shot and killed.
For jaywalking.
For jaywalking.
Right.
Michael Brown.
Yes. Well, the difficult part of this, aside from the tragedy, is that there are so many things about the facts of the case that we don't know. And that is part of the frustration and the anger of the Ferguson community, is that evidence has been withheld throughout the process in terms of we didn't know until maybe 6 or 7 days in what the name of the officer was who actually shot Mr. Brown. We didn't know how many shots were fired. We didn't know what the forensic evidence was. And some of those questions we still don't have answers. And because of the layers of racism in the Ferguson Police Department and even statewide with law enforcement, there has been a generational distrust of law enforcement in that community. And so what's happened is that through the tragic killing of Michael Brown by this officer, Darren Wilson, we now have not one, not two, but 3 investigations that are going on simultaneously. We've got the criminal investigation that's being headed by the prosecutor's office. We've got the internal investigation that's going on by law enforcement of its own officer with an officer-involved shooting. And then we have the FBI and the federal government that have come in to conduct a civil rights violation investigation to determine whether or not Michael Brown's civil rights were violated in the manner in which he was shot. So we have 3 layers of investigation that are going on right now, and we still don't have all of the answers.
Let's talk about when the Ferguson Police Department finally decided to say something.
Right.
And the media, I think, played right into their hands as they began to, would thugify Mr. Brown be too harsh?
Well, that's what the community has been saying. You know, immediately what happened is there's been a call by the community. Who was the officer? Who was involved? How many times was he shot? Give us some information. And they withheld that information. And when they finally decided that they were going to release the information on the same day that the acting supervisor of the police department released the information of the officer who shot Mr. Brown, they released this video that portrays what we now know to believe is Mr. Brown involved in a possible robbery of a convenience store that preceded the incident that resulted in Mr. Brown's death. The problem with that is what that says is that this must have been someone who was committing a crime and therefore he, quote, deserved to be shot. But what ended up happening was that we later found out was that this particular officer didn't have any knowledge of the previous investigation with regard to this alleged convenience store. So the reason that that's important is in the state of Missouri, if law enforcement believe that an officer is or has been involved in the commission of a felony, they have the right to use justifiable force, and that force can be deadly. So the presumption was if this officer knew that Mr. Brown may have been involved or may have been a suspect in an alleged robbery at a convenience store, which happened within the 2 hours prior to the shooting, then he would have been justified in approaching him and or firing a fatal shot. The problem with that is now that we know that he didn't have that knowledge, so we go back to the presumption as to whether or not the officer was in reasonable fear of immediate death or bodily injury, which would have given him justifiable cause to fire a fatal shot to Mr. Brown. And we still don't know the answer to those questions because, again, we don't know what's happened in the minutes immediately prior to the shooting because of this investigation being ongoing. So there are still so many questions that we don't have. And so what the call has been is for there to not be a rush to judgment, to allow law enforcement to do its job, but to have significant oversight based upon their failure to do their job in the past. So you have this agency that no one trusts because there's been previous instances of racism, and now you're being charged to, in an impartial way, present evidence to a grand jury, which is private and secret, and none of us gets to hear what evidence is presented, and we're supposed to trust you. The community has a problem with that.
It's also interesting that as you investigate the Ferguson Police Department, we've come to understand that many of the law enforcement officers there,
Yes.
the patrol people, have prior bad records with other departments.
Right.
It seems like Ferguson may have become a dumping ground.
Right. And not only that, but the disparity and diversity within the police department of Ferguson. 53 officers, only 3 African American, in a community that's nearly 70% African American. So there is an automatic distrust in the way that law enforcement in that particular community has dealt with their citizens because there's been such a layer of discrimination and racism in the handling of law enforcement cases. Another issue is that the governor clearly failed to acknowledge that there were any problems with regard to race relations in that community, and went on the record and said that there's no problems with race in this community. He never visited the community during the incident, with the exception of conducting press conference to send out the National Guard. And the militarization of the police is another thing that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Sure.
You know, how a community gets to the level where in your mind you think it's appropriate to send the National Guard with tanks and guns to deal with an issue when all they want is answers.
And we are beginning to find out more and more every day. It seems that where all of this surplus military equipment comes from.
Right, and to think that there are millions and millions of dollars of federal grants that have been provided to law enforcement agencies across the country to do productive things, and that these millions and dollars of equipment get donated to law enforcement, and those become the very tools that are used to essentially handstrap a community. It's just unthinkable. If you looked at the photos and the coverage that we saw throughout this last 11 to 12 days, you would truly feel like you were in a military zone.
We've also recently, and this past Wednesday, saw some new video of folk on their property, in their yard, a large gathering in their yard. And the military police, not really military, but the police who are dressed in military fatigue uniforms and tanks come by and fire tear gas in them.
Right, and one of the most heart-wrenching parts of this investigation and this tragic scenario is the children of the community that have been affected throughout this investigation. Media has done a fairly decent job of portraying community reaction to this basically taking over of their community. And these students have not been to school since this incident has happened. They have kept schools closed for the safety of the children while they are investigating a crime. So these students have been hostages in their own homes and have been
for at least 2 weeks.
For at least 2 weeks. And so the question is, you know, at what point do we sit down and decide whether or not, from a law enforcement standpoint, this investigation and the safety of the community has been handled in a correct way? And I just think that we haven't gotten to the point, at least from a legislative standpoint in that community, to where that can be a fair conversation. And that's why organizations like the NAACP and other civic-minded groups, along with the FBI and the Department of Justice, have had to step in and say, we need to look at your procedures and how you handle these types of conflicts.
We know of Ferguson to be a small community, what we would call a bedroom community for St. Louis.
Sure.
But the NAACP for the greater St. Louis area has currently 5 civil rights complaints against the Ferguson Police Department.
Yes, and not only the Ferguson Police Department, but also other state law enforcement agencies in the state of Missouri that have had connections to St. Louis County, which is where the incident happened. And the issue and the perception of the NAACP from that branch's perspective is that you have had plenty of time to address our concerns, to respond in a lawful way to show what's being done in terms of policing the police, so to speak, and you failed to do that in these 5 previous times. What has changed to make us think that your handling of this case will be any different, especially in light of the fact that his father was killed in a law enforcement officer-related shooting during the investigation of 2 black suspects? Now,
the prosecutor.
Yes, the prosecutor, right. Well, the issue is that it's the grand jury that makes a decision about whether or not to indict the officer
in this secret.
Right. It's secret.
That's the law.
That's the law. And what happens is that not only is it secret, but the prosecutor makes a decision as to which evidence to present to the grand jury. So the community's distrust is that this law enforcement, this prosecutor will not present all of the evidence to the grand jury so that they can have the full story in order to be able to make a decision as to whether or not the shooting was justified or not. And the issue is that you get one shot at an indictment. You don't get to go back and do over like you get a retrial in the event that an individual is found not guilty. If they do what's called a no bill or no prosecution, it never gets to the prosecution standpoint. And there's been calls for a special prosecutor to be appointed in the state for this issue. And with regard to how a special prosecutor is appointed, there's 2 different ways that happens. The prosecutor can decide, I need help, therefore I'm going to go to the governor of my state. The governor is going to appoint the state attorney general's office to come in and do the investigation. The other part is that the court on its own accord can come in and appoint a special prosecutor if it feels that there's been a conflict of interest. And that's what the community of Ferguson is asking for the court to do.
Well, a circuit judge also offered some relief.
Yes.
When the community was also, or the media was talking about the makeup of the grand jury.
Right.
And the prosecutor would not do that, would not release that. And now she has ordered that the makeup, that you can talk about the composition of the grand jury.
Yes.
Do you believe that even that step, it seems like everything that looks like transparency or fairness, someone has to make them do it every step of the way.
Right, and that's what I was going to comment on. The fact that the prosecutor had to be court ordered to provide that bit of information, is problematic. But the other part of it is that as a prosecutor, when you want to present evidence to the grand jury, you don't want there to be any opportunity for bias or for mistrust. But when you have such a high-profile case like the one that we're dealing with here, all bets are off in terms of, if I know the reason that the community has concerns and releasing this information doesn't justify the integrity of the facts of the case, then in my opinion, he has an affirmative duty to turn over that information. And unfortunately, in his mind, for this particular case, he felt like that wasn't something that should have been disclosed, and the court disagreed.
I think it might be important at this point to remind our audience, those who are aware, and also inform those who may not be aware, that you're an attorney, but you also are a former prosecutor.
Yes. Yes.
And so you have some experience in knowing what how the process works.
Right. And the thing is that when you have a case that there is a high profile case with regard to the media, the worst thing that can happen is that your witnesses can be tainted by what they've seen or heard from outside sources. And to the extent that you're going to call witnesses to the grand jury to ask questions and to provide testimony, that is dangerous in terms of the credibility of those witnesses if their knowledge is not firsthand. So I understand the perception of wanting to protect the evidence, but this is a case where we have had eyewitnesses that have been given their accounts on the media to the media since the incident has happened, and part of the reason that they have said that they have spoken to the media is because their evidence wasn't being considered by law enforcement and the prosecutor that was investigating the case. So they felt like, if I don't speak to the media, this is the only way that I can make sure that evidence is heard that will go to whether or not the shooting was justifiable. And you mentioned the term thugified. That's something that also happened with regard to those witnesses, because as soon as their testimony came out, there were reports by media who talked about, well, this person has this prior criminal history and this person has been involved in crime in this way, in an effort to discredit the credibility of those individuals. In a court of law, there's a way to do that. But when you are fact-finding at the beginning of the case, you want to know whether or not there are witnesses who have firsthand knowledge in what they saw. Because for the grand jury, you don't just present the prosecution's case, you present the entire case. You present the weaknesses, you present exculpatory evidence, you present those things that the defense would present so that the grand jury has a well-rounded view of the case, and then it can decide whether or not a jury should make the decision. You don't just get to do it one-sided.
What do your thoughts on the Attorney General coming, not in aid, but the Attorney General of the United States of America, Eric Holden, coming to Ferguson?
I think that because there were allegations that Michael Brown's civil rights were violated, the agency that investigates civil rights violations is the Department of Justice and/or the FBI. So I think that that was the appropriate agency that was charged with that task. There's been a lot of discussion and/or regret or kind of disappointment at the fact that President Obama has not gone to Ferguson to address the community specifically. My issue is that the Department of Justice is the one that makes the investigative decisions, and that they need to be involved firsthand. To the extent that President Obama would make a trip to the region, that doesn't change the job of the Department of Justice. So I don't think that it's a slight that he didn't go. I think he sent his best, and he sent the individual who has a sworn obligation to investigate civil rights violations wherever they may occur.
And let's talk about another case that's going to be coming up in September.
Yes.
Michael Dunn, retrial and sentencing.
Right. Well, that's what some people have come to know as the loud music case, where there was an issue in Florida where, in Michael Dunn's mind, it started with an incident of some young black teens in a car who were playing music too loud in the community. There was an altercation that occurred, and he alleges, he being Mr. Dunn, alleges that he was in fear for his life, so he shot into a car with 4 unarmed teens, killing 1 and injuring the 3 others. When the case first went to the jury, they convicted Mr. Dunn of the 3 counts of attempted murder for the individuals that were in the car, but they were hung or couldn't reach a verdict as to the death of Jordan Davis, who actually died in the case.
Who's a 17-year-old.
At 17-year-old.
Unarmed.
Unarmed, exactly. And so what happened is the state attorney's office made the decision to retry the case, and so that trial comes up again in September, and they have started pretrial arguments in that case. He could face up to 60 years on the attempted murder charges, but because those attempted murder convictions don't account for the death of Jordan Davis, the state has rightfully, in my opinion, decided to retry Dunn as it relates to the homicide charge.
Now, and it's important for our viewers to understand, the 3 attempted murder cases, that's solid. That stands.
He's been convicted of those, but he has not yet been sentenced.
But that stands.
Yes, sentencing for all 4, regardless as to what they decide on the homicide case, he's going to be sentenced after the retrial for Jordan Davis's death.
If we don't begin to get some kind of understanding this, you know, in the neighborhood, they say, well, it's better to kill them all. And then if he'd killed them all, maybe he wouldn't have to go to jail at all.
Well, my thing is that I don't want anybody to be dead, so I'm not going to advise that. But with regard to the state of the law, another issue that...
And I don't want anybody to be dead either, but I'm saying...
No, I hear you. And the mindset is that, you know, I can't understand how you can justify one verdict as it relates to the other when they were all in the car together, and I do understand that. But another rub that's come up with regard to this case is that there's been a change in the self-defense law in the state of Florida between the time when he was tried for all four and there was a hung jury on Jordan Davis's death and the retrial. So the change in the law may change whether or not the state is able to get a conviction for the homicide case as it relates to Mr. Dunn. So hopefully that will be the case and there will be justice for the death of Mr. Dunn, with the death of Mr. Davis as well.
Let's talk about something that's happening with our local Sarasota Police Department. And across the country, we're beginning to see, for me, almost every law enforcement agency has at least a few dash cams in their cars, if not in every car.
Right.
And now they're beginning to see body-mounted cameras.
Right.
The Sarasota City Commission granted a request of the Police Chief Bernadette DePino, a week ago, to purchase body cams for her police officers.
Right.
She says she believes that in controversial cases, the body cam does two things. It protects the public and it protects law enforcement officers. It protects the public because
you have an instant record as to what happened.
Record.
Right.
And it protects the law enforcement officer who may be having bogus claims made against him.
Right, right.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I think with regard to the dash cams and transferring to the body cams, I think that in light of what's happened with Michael Brown and the tons of Michael Browns across the nation that have been shot and been unarmed, it is another tool of investigation that gives us a eye view into the officer's perception. Because what happens is that when you're looking at whether or not an officer-involved shooting is justified, it's the mindset of the officer at the time that he pulls the trigger that is paramount. So if you can see what that officer sees in the heat of that battle, then it helps determine whether or not the shooting was justifiable, whether there were less alternative means, restrictions that they could have used, whether it may have been a stun gun or a taser, or in the Michael Brown case, one of the things that's being discussed is the 35 feet between the police officer's vehicle and where Michael Brown's body laid to rest. And with forensics, they are attempting to try to determine what the distance was when Darren Wilson made the first shot. So a body cam will answer a lot of those questions, especially when compared to eyewitness testimony, which sometimes is not reliable. So I think that it is an enforcement tool that should be used in all cases. I think that anytime that officers are out on the street and if they have the resources to make those cameras available, they should do it. In this particular incident, they got a grant from the Department of Justice to begin to purchase some cams. I'm hoping that the City Commission or they'll be able to find additional funds to expand the number of cams that they have.
So that all officers could have it?
Absolutely. And so like you said, it protects the officer, it gives a second set of eyes, but it also sheds some light as to whether or not officer, and it doesn't have to be a shooting, it could be the officer's handling of the case, it could be whether or not evidence is in question. I mean, it is a bird's eye tool that basically fills in the gaps for a lot of questions. And so I think that it's definitely a good thing. I think that it is a tool that's helpful with community policing to basically bring the information to the community, to law enforcement, and to legislators so that they can see whether or not there may be issues in terms of needing more manpower, needing more officers on the road, assessing what types of crimes need more attention. So I think it's a win-win.
You know, last weekend here in Sarasota, along with in many other communities, there was a very large demonstration calling for justice, calling for justice for Michael Brown and many other, just went down the list of all the others were killed, as well as Rodney Mitchell, who was killed by the Sheriff's Department.
Right.
one of the things that's in question from the attorneys for the Rodney Mitchell family and the attorneys for law enforcement, or the investigators for Rodney Mitchell's family and investigators for law enforcement, was when were the shots fired? What was going on?
Right.
Body cams would have worked very well in that situation.
I believe so. Absolutely.
And I want to go back to Michael Brown just for a minute, because this past Wednesday, there came a new witness surface.
Yes.
Was brought by his or her attorney, we don't know if it's male or female, who happened to be recording something entirely different in the area, and you can hear during that recording the 6 shots fired, that everyone is beginning to say it was 6 shots now. And then a pause, about another 4 or 5 seconds, and then 4 more shots fired.
Right, right.
Now, they are trying to authenticate that tape.
Yes.
But it's interesting that the witness was afraid to bring it to law enforcement. The witness got an attorney.
Right.
And the attorney came to the media first.
Right. And that goes to the heightened level of mistrust between the community and law enforcement for various reasons. And another thing that was important with regard to the audio, there was a series of shots, and then there was a pause, and then there was another series of shots. But for the forensic team that actually conducted the investigation of the crime scene, they found 12 shell casings. So what that means is that 6 shots made contact with Mr. Brown, but 12 shots at least were fired from the gun casings that they found at the scene. And for the gap in time in between the 2 sets of shots, there are theories that go both ways. Some people think that that gap in time supports the eyewitnesses that have said that Mr. Brown had his hands up and was in a surrendered position, and that the officer continued to shoot. There are other people that say, that support law enforcement, that there was possibly a charge from Mr. Brown toward law enforcement during this pause, and that's why there was another series of shots. We don't know. Body cam might have answered that question.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting, too, because this is not going away.
Right.
And until something is done, we will have these kind of incidents all over the country.
Right. Right.
Continuously.
Right. And then we've still got to talk about what is the appropriate law enforcement response when there is a tragedy in a community. How do we ever get to the point where the National Guard gets called in? Would that have happened in any other non-minority community? What would have happened if the officer who shot was black and the victim was white? What would have happened if the officer who shot was black and the victim was black? And until we have these discussions to really talk about this true cognitive bias that exists, that because I see you and you are a certain color, I automatically have a perception that you are dangerous, and therefore force is justifiable in this situation. Until we deal with that dialogue, then no grand jury indictment is going to address that issue.
We're going to have to leave it right there and continue it next week.
Okay.